One who's been driving around in the last 8 weeks or so, you will know, as I do, that there's been an absolute explosion of cyclists. And funnily enough, it seems to coincide with the weather. So, for example, the better the weather is, the more bikes are out on the streets. Let's talk to Nick Freeman right now and find out what he wants to do. Nick, a very good morning to you. Welcome.
Good morning, Mike. Thanks
very much indeed. I quite like this phrase, toxic cycling, because there's no doubt in my mind that there are an awful lot of cyclists out there who do not give a stuff for the rules, who do not care about the highway code, who do not care at all about red lights, about cycle lanes or cycle tracks as they're now being called. And for London, for example, and you can tell me about other parts of the country, I mean, the mayor and his sort of obsessiveness has led to the most ridiculous sort of street furniture now, and curbs all over the place, and different lanes of things, and different, ways of travelling, that it's very, very confusing for people.
Yeah, I mean, look, we've been blessed, haven't we, with lockdown and the most amazing weather, and it's like a sort of heaven sent to paradise to cyclists, and there literally no cars, or have been no cars on the road. So cyclists have been presented with an opportunity to do what they will. And of course, some cyclists, as you say, cycle responsibly, but there's been an increasing number. I use the expression toxic cycling. I mean, because they cycle very dangerously, they seem to have sort of stealth, they sneak up quietly behind you, they miss you narrowly, and some of them, unfortunately, seem to derive pleasure from this.
Yes.
And at the end of the day, they go very quickly, they pose a huge danger. And my problem is this: in the same way that some motorists have been taking advantage of the empty roads and been driving like lunatics as well. So,
listen, I mean, I have to say,
I'm not in favour of anyone who's a lunatic, whether it be on a cycle or whether you're in a car. With a car, you have a registered number, we know who you are. On a pedal cycle, we don't know who you are. You have this protection of anonymity. And whilst there are rules in place, I mean, most of the Road Traffic Act, a great deal of it, applies to cyclists. The big problem is, well, that's all good and well, but who are they? You have a video of someone cycling in a dangerous manner. Well, who is it? We don't know. So the starting point will be to have a registered tabard or on the back. So someone wears a high-vis vest, and there's a registration number on there. So if anyone witnesses something, they have a registration number in the same way that they do with motorists. They send that into a central base, and there is a legal obligation to say who is the registered owner of that cycle, and there are penalties for not complying with it.
Yes.
That will be my starting point, because I think once you make people take account, they become responsible. At the moment, they cycle with impunity, because unless they're stopped and apprehended at the scene, we've no idea who it is. So that will be my starting point.
But one of the things that we're now used to, Nick, and you must be used to in a big way, is that most traffic offences are not recorded by humans at all. They're recorded by devices. They're recorded by cameras. They're recorded by, something going off, as you're going up the wrong way up a one-way street, or you're parking somewhere you're not supposed to park. It's very unlikely for you to ever be handed a ticket by someone.
Well, absolutely. And also it's important to remember that the cyclists have these cameras affixed to their helmets.
Yeah.
They record everything, every transgression in relation to a motorist. If a motorist has a camera, what he shows is, well, we've got a particularly bad piece of cycling, but who is it? And that's the starting point, isn't it? Until we address that problem, we're never going to move off. And I think the moment that problem is addressed, cyclists will automatically know, I need to cycle responsibly because I'm now accountable. People will know who I am. And then, of course, in relation to that accountability, at the moment, unless somebody is convicted of wanton and furious cycling, which is an 1861 offence, so that's how far we go back.
Is that what that guy was done for who ran into the woman?
That's correct.
Yeah.
It's 1861 legislation that if you're caught cycling dangerously, the maximum penalty is £2,500. Okay, there is no penalty point system, there's no disqualification, there is no custody. Okay, so that the penalties for the most serious type, and if you hit someone, injure someone, or kill someone, unless you could be successfully prosecuted under that section of the 1861 legislation, the Offences Against the Person Act, and that has a maximum sentence of 2 years. So in other words, you can drive dangerously, you can kill someone, and unless you could be convicted of manslaughter or murder, you're going to be charged with an offence that carries a maximum sentence of 2 years. And that is very hard to prove. It's very remote. For the majority, if you're caught driving dangerously, your case will probably end up at the Crown Court, and you have every likelihood of going to prison.
Yes.
So there needs to be parity. There needs to be, in my view, a point system in the same way. There basically needs to be parity with motorists and cyclists. We need to know who you are. They need to have insurance. And we need to have proper penalties So to a large extent, with that accountability, the sentencers will police themselves if the sentences are appropriate. At the moment, most offences are dealt with by way of a £50 fixed penalty ticket, if you can find out who it is.
Right.
And of course, the police have got better things to do, haven't they?
Yes.
And I know it does. The problem at the moment is we've got motorists now back on the road, and we've got this friction that exists. You know, the cyclists have claimed ownership of the road during lockdown, and they've now got to. And there was an aggression before that, and now they've had 8-9 weeks of owning the roads, and they're now having to give way to the motorists again. And there is going to be some terrible accidents.
Yes.
And
the thing that I find extraordinary with the cyclists, particularly those who do flout the law and who are aggressive, is that they're the likely injured parties here. They're not, you know, if they get into a fight with me in my Range Rover, they ain't going to win it. Do you know what I mean?
They won't win it at the roadside, but they probably will win it in court.
No, I'm talking about if it's an encounter which involves one of us falling over.
Yeah, no, they are so vulnerable, and this legislation that I'm proposing is designed to protect them. And as you said earlier on, some of them are very vitriolic, and they don't like to change. They want to be able to continue cycling with impunity and anonymity. And the time has come now for everyone to be responsible, because there are far too many serious accidents involving cars and cyclists. Tragically, where cyclists receive fatal injuries or serious injuries. It isn't even compulsory to wear a helmet, and many cyclists will say, well, I don't want to wear a helmet. Motorists have to wear a seatbelt.
Right.
So we just need to look at the law very sensibly and have a literally parity system between the two, in my view.
Yes, and also every single day that I'm on the road, I see a cyclist with headphones in, not listening, rolling around all over the road. I mean, I nearly ran one over by St Paul's one day because he was a delivery cyclist and he had one of those boxes on the front of his bike, and he suddenly, for no apparent reason, just decided to go completely sort of at a right angle across the road in front of my car, and he had headphones in because he didn't know I was there.
No, well, if we're distracted at driving a car, we face 3 to 9 points, possible disqualification, etc., for driving without due care and attention.
Yeah.
A cyclist, the worst that could happen, if you know who it is, and obviously you don't, because you've got no means, unless you're going to get out and say, right, what's your name and address, where are you from, and he's going to tell you probably where to go, you're not going to make any progress. The maximum fine will be £1,000 if you were prepared to go through that, and of course risk exposing yourself to potentially very aggressive behaviour on their part.
No, that's absolutely right. So how would it work in your view, this registration? Because I've talked about this in the past, and when people have said, well, how would you do it? I've always said, well, could you not in some way attach almost a registration number to the back of the saddle? Would you have it done more electronically than that?
Well, I'd have it very similar to DVLA, but it's an issue of whether you have it on the bike or whether you have it. I would prefer to have a tabard, so that every cyclist, so we know who's cycling, and that who you have to wear a tabard. There has to be a registration, so it doesn't relate to the bike; it relates to you.
So you could almost have it in the way that people have fishing licenses on their back.
Yeah, absolutely. So we know who you are. With cars, the notice actually goes to the registered keeper, and the registered keeper then has to nominate the driver. It would be simpler, in my view, just to have a tabard, because it's not. There should be a high-vis jacket. I would make that compulsory, a high-vis vest with their tabard. That is who you are. It could even have a name and a number there, couldn't it? But I'm sure there's a way around it to preserve people's privacy. So we know there's a central registration system, and if you commit an offence, then that is reported, and we know at the press of a button who you are. The authorities know who you are, and they can proceed to investigate the case.
Yes, exactly. And that would seem to me to be a perfectly legitimate form of action, because at the moment there doesn't ever seem to be any police interest in prosecuting cyclists. There doesn't ever seem to be any police officers around, even though there have been more of them around. I've actually watched police officers watching cyclists go through red lights, and they don't do anything.
Well, because what's the point? It's going to be a nominal financial penalty, no points. They don't have a licence. They don't need to make sure their bikes are roadworthy. We have to have an MOT for our cars. They're basically excused from an awful lot of things, and the time has come for change now. There's this tension with very limited road space, and we've got to all look at it responsibly and say, right, in the same way motorists need to overtake sensibly, we need to share it, but until you make people accountable, they're going to behave irresponsibly, and if you're going to be accountable, we need to know who you are. That has to be the starting point, doesn't it?
Yes, exactly right. And I suppose somebody would say, what about children? Because children are also cyclists, and they can sometimes be quite young children who cycle. I mean, I would not let my young children cycle on the roads at all, because they're far too dangerous. But as they become teenagers, they might want to be going out. They might use their bike to go from point A to point B. What would you do with them?
That's a very good question, and
listen,
you've got me on the hop there.
Sorry,
give that some thought.
No, the only reason, Nick, I'm asking you is because I've talked about registration for cyclists for many a year. This has been one of my bugbears. I'm so grateful for you for coming on and actually bringing some legal expertise to it, because I've been advocating this for a long time. But there are a couple of sort of loopholes, if you like, that do come up, and one of them is kids.
Yeah, if they're at an age where they're old enough to cycle on a road without supervision, in my view, I would have a tabard in exactly the same way, because they're old enough to commit offences.
Yes.
And they will learn like a learner driver learns. We need to cycle responsibly. Why should they be excused from...
No, listen, I totally agree.
The law. If they're on the road, it's a serious place to be, and they need to comply with the law. And I would actually introduce a law that says that children under a certain age, and it probably will be something like 16, are not allowed to cycle unaccompanied, or it may be younger than that. I'm just talking thinking as I'm talking to you. But then they have to be identified. If children, most children, and we're talking about young children, they're always accompanied by parents, aren't they, who would obviously have to be identifiable.
Yes, exactly.
And there needs to be a disqualification system in place. At the moment, you can drive paralytically drunk on the road, on a cycle, and you're driving whilst unfit through alcohol. You cannot be disqualified for cycling. Although, interestingly enough, if you are apprehended, the court does have power to disqualify you, even though you're on a bike, from driving a car.
Yeah.
But I've never heard that. I've never heard of that being invoked. It's a rare piece of legislation. But actually, if you're driving... it's unfit. There's no limit. It's a case of if you're unfit, you cannot be disqualified from cycling, which again seems perverse, doesn't it?
Well, it does, doesn't it? Because also insurance should be carried for all sorts of reasons. Because
there should be compulsory insurance.
Yeah, I mean, you can damage cars, you can damage property, you can damage people, individuals. I mean, one of my bugbears at the moment as well, talking about sort of teenagers and young people, is these kids who are inevitably ne'er-do-wells. I don't wish to in any way brand them all like this, but they do that thing where they raise the front whole wheel up and cycle on the back wheel.
I think it's called a wheelie.
A wheelie, yeah.
Like most motorcyclists do.
Yeah, but they're doing it in such a way that is almost intimidatory. They do it in parts of London.
It's incredibly dangerous as well.
Yeah, it's incredibly dangerous. If you're driving behind one of them, you don't know whether they're going to fall down and go under the wheels of the car. If they're coming towards you, you don't have no idea. You have no way of knowing if they're going to be able to come at you in a straight line of any kind. It's quite bizarre.
And the problem from the motorist perspective is, apart from obviously being well protected, is if you injure a cyclist, the starting point is it's your fault. And although it isn't formulated so much in law, the burden literally is for you now to prove at a high level, it wasn't my fault, he did this or he did that, and that's how this accident happened. The starting point is, we're going to look at you, we assume you've done something wrong. How was you driving? Were you on your phone? Did you have your radio too loud? Were you looking at your sat-nav? Explain how you caused this injury. Even though he's come right off, swerve without any indication, they're going to look at you to see if they can point the finger of blame at you. And many motorists don't realise, actually, that is the reality of the law at the moment.
Yes, absolutely right. So how are we going to get this, how are we going to make this happen, Nick?
Well, I think more and more motorists are now waking up to the idea that something needs to be done. The Boris Johnson has sort of held this the golden era for cyclists, and I would love to be able to cycle on the rare occasions I'm in my office and not in court. I would love to cycle the 17 miles into my office, but for me it's so dangerous. So, the Sharps has been talking about a £2 billion investment. We need a massive investment in the infrastructure, so that we have safe, preserved cycle lanes, and I would say that those have to be used by cyclists.
Yes.
So that you use them, they're protected not by paint, but by high sort of curb, so that you are protected and you cycle there. And then, there'll be many more cyclists on the road, because I'm sure lots of people would like to cycle, but it's just too dangerous.
Well, it's very dangerous. There's hordes of them, and I'll leave you with one final example of something I saw a few weeks back. I was on Lower Thames Street, which goes along from sort of Tower Hill down to Westminster, and they've got a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit there, and they've got a cycle lane on the right-hand side of the dual carriageway, right, which used to be a dual carriageway. It's now a single lane for cars, of course, in both directions. A cycle cyclist was cycling on my side of the road, not in the cycle lane. I slowed to 20 miles an hour from 22 because that's how nervous we all are about getting a ticket, right?
In the tolerance, right?
Yeah, so I'm down to 20 or 19. This guy overtakes me on the inside at about 25, and of course the speed camera doesn't go off.
No, well, it won't, and because, of course, he's not driving a motor vehicle, so he's not going to be prosecuted unless there's a particular... Certain places have bylaws to detect speeding cyclists, but most don't, and there's no particular offence under the Road Traffic Act for speeding at all. So they can speed because they're not in a motor vehicle. That's why there needs to be parity legislation, and there needs to be penalties in a similar way to motorists, and then people will take their cycling very seriously in terms of the way they cycle, what they wear, and the state of their machine. In the same way that motorists have to.
Well, let's not talk about what they wear, because I don't want to start feeling unwell at this time of the morning. Nick, thank you very much indeed. Nick Freeman, Mr. Loophole there, with a very good idea of registration for cyclists.